Good evening, everyone. I'm Liz Krueger, State Senator from the East Side of Manhattan. I'm delighted that you all can be joining us tonight. We have an important show, controversial for some, but critical for all of us to be discussing. Embracing our multicultural city, what we can do to combat religious and racial hatred. We have a really excellent group of speakers. And of course, we'll be taking questions towards the end, many of which you've already submitted to us. Tonight, I want to remind everyone that unless you've called in and are listening by phone, you're viewing us on Zoom or Facebook, and that you can get closed captioning through both of those systems. If you're on Zoom, click on the live transcript in the meeting controls to start viewing closed captioning. If you're on Facebook Live, you will see a settings button on the bottom right corner of the video. Click closed caption CC to start viewing closed captionings. Before we get to our special guests and the discussion, I always start off by making some timely announcements and reminders. First, before we begin, let's just say at the 800,000th time, if you are listening and you have not gotten vaccinated, or you don't know people, or you know people who have not gotten vaccinated and they're over the age of 12, you just have to do it, please. You have to do it for yourself. You have to do it for your family members. You have to do it for total strangers who could be at risk. And of course, getting vaccinated is basically risk-free for you and ensures that you can get out there and move on with your life and do most of the things you were doing before the pandemic came. So again, if you don't know how to find a vaccination site, we have endless ways that you can do so. You can call my office tomorrow. You can call a hotline number 877-829-4692. You could call 311 and ask them. Pretty much anybody who's working in government in any level has information about how to help you and your family members get vaccinated. And it doesn't have to cost you anything, and nobody has to worry about legal status or sharing information they don't think they can share with government. We just want 100% of the people who live here to be vaccinated for all our sakes. All right, so moving on to tonight's event. You should know that this event is being recorded and that everyone who RSVP'd for tonight's event will receive an email of a link to the video a couple of days after the event. It will also be accessible online. There are also all kinds of resources that the groups that were working with us have shared with us that can be incredibly valuable and helpful for you to have. And we will make those available to people whose emails we have, as well as putting those up online. So if you hear one of or two of our guests talk about some specific resource, don't think you have to madly write it down or you'll never hear about it again, because you can have access to all that information after tonight's event. Whenever men or women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe. This quote comes from Elie Wiesel, the Nobel Prize Peace acceptance speech Mr. Wiesel made. Mr. Wiesel was a Holocaust survivor who dedicated his life to fighting against hatred around the world. If we are to follow Mr. Wiesel's directive, New Yorkers must pay special attention to our thriving multicultural city, which has unfortunately been plagued with a rising set of incidents of racial and religious hatred and violence. You know, I've been here forever and I thought we were somehow immune because we all live on top of each other, next to each other, intermarry with each other, have spent our lives in group community because we are so multicultural. But disturbingly, this dangerous, dangerous pattern throughout our country has not spared us in New York City. The NYPD Hate Crimes Unit reports between last year and this year, we have seen a 49% increase in anti-Semitic incidents, a 100% increase in anti-Black incidents, and a 335% increase in anti-Asian incidents. If you read the newspapers in the morning or watch the evening news, you can't avoid hearing about these situations or seeing them. I believe statistics like this are devastating. We have to do everything we can to reverse this pattern, which is why I wanted to bring everyone together tonight to start conversations, if you haven't already started them, about the causes of hate-based incidents. We will talk about strategies to build alliances to strengthen the fabric of our communities, which can make us more resilient and strong enough to withstand bigotry. We are fortunate to have 3 speakers this evening who are doing important work with organizations and communities in New York and around the nation to combat this kind of hate. They are the Reverend Dr. Chloe Breyer, Executive Director of the Interfaith Center of New York, the Reverend Mark E. Fowler, the CEO of the Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding, and Brittny-Jade Saunders, Deputy Commissioner for Strategic Initiatives at the New York City Commission on Human Rights. Our speakers have provided numerous links to important resources, as I said before, and the links will be posted in the chat and put on my website and be sent out to everyone who's getting links to tonight's town hall. Included among the resources are those from Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. Please read the information about important initiatives they have developed to prevent and address hate violence called New York City Against Hate. After the presentation, I will moderate the Q&A portion of the event, and you can still submit questions through the Q&A function in Zoom and Facebook. We can't guarantee we get to every question. We try, but we are almost never successful because so many people ask such important questions that come to them as the presenters are presenting. So now I'd like to turn it over to our first special guest, Reverend Mark Fowler.
Thank you so much, Senator. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. I'm going to share my screen and share a couple of slides to start us off this evening. I also like to start all of my presentations probably over the last year and a half with a land acknowledgement, and recognize that I'm speaking to you from my home in Flatbush, Brooklyn. I am on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Munsee Lenape people, as are all of us if we are in the New York City area. And as we're having this conversation tonight around our multicultural imperative, if you will, and religious and racial strife, I think it's critical that we actually acknowledge the people who ongoingly are experiencing disassociation from their, not just their ancestral lands, but have been kind of cast to the four winds. So I just ask that the ancestors of this land would look favorably upon this time that we have together. And with that said, I, as have been introduced, am the CEO of the Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. We are a secular, non-sectarian, not-for-profit. Our mission is to combat religious prejudice, to promote justice and build respect for religious differences. And we do that by transforming individuals and institutions to work against prejudice, hate, and violence caused by or in the name of religion. We have 5 primary program areas, which you see on the screen. And I'll hope to be pulling information from a little bit of each of these program areas to address tonight's theme. We do work in peace building, where we identify and raise the profile of religiously motivated peace activists who work in conflict zones around the world, who I am convinced their work are examples of the ways in which we might be able to begin to address some of the differences that we are experiencing and some of the strife that we're experiencing, whether it is armed conflict or not. We also do work in education where we provide training and resources to teachers and school systems about how to teach about religious diversity. And in addition, to work with teachers and educators so that they are comfortable and competent teaching about religious diversity. We provide training and resources in healthcare for medical professionals as well as for non-clinical staff on the ways in which patients and families make decisions that are based in their religious beliefs and practices. We work with over 50 global corporations and large non-for-profits on their policies and their practices, trainings for their managers, presentations to the C-suite, and often working around creating a religiously inclusive workforce that includes and addresses the needs of non-believers as well. And finally, we do work in interreligious affairs where we look at the roots of religious prejudice that are often found within sacred text. And some of the work I'm hoping that we'll do in the next few years is to also talk about the ways in which the roots of religious prejudice are in the places where we give ourselves permission to still have bias against people of other religious and non-religious beliefs. So that's a little quick thing about the work that we do. Very honored to be here tonight. I'm going to bring up as a way for us to start the conversation 2 statements one at a time. And I'm going to ask you to just think about and raise your hand wherever you are if you would agree or strongly agree with each of the statements, and just consider what your answer would be. So here's the first statement. I always treat people of other religious faiths with respect. If you would agree or strongly agree with that statement, wherever you are, just raise your hand or just think about it and kind of keep the answer in your head. I'm going to bring up another statement and same interaction. If you agree or strongly agree with the statement, please raise your mental hand, if you will. People of other religious faiths always treat me with respect. Now, for some, it may be you answered yes, that you always treat people of other religious faiths with respect, and people of other religious faiths always treat you with respect. But in our experience at Tanenbaum, what we see is a little bit of a different dynamic. These 2 statements come from a Gallup poll that was conducted in 2004, 17 years ago. And in that Gallup poll, which was called the Tolerance Index, 95% of people polled, and it was a sample of about 3,500 people, said that they always treated people of other religious faiths with respect. But only about 65% of the same group of people reported that people of other religious faiths always treated them with respect. And we think that we're often being very respectful, but one of the things that we think is at the root of this is the distinction between the intent of our actions and the impact of them. That we often feel that we are engaging in respectful behavior, that we are offering to people and treating them the way we would like to be treated, but we sometimes don't take enough time to ask people and find out how do they want to be treated, whether they're of a different religious faith or not, or of no particular religious belief. I am sure that many of us are familiar with the golden rule, to treat others the way we would like to be treated. But at Tanenbaum, we're very much adherents of the platinum rule, to treat others the way they would like to be treated. And we're all have kind of made a commitment to try and answer, at least pre-answer some of the questions that you sent in advance. And I would say that one of the things that we can do to build more respect for each other is to actually hit the pause button when we think that we're engaging in behavior that we believe is respectful, and check in with the person that we're interacting with to find out, are they having the experience of being respected? Some other information I'd like to share with you comes from a survey that was done by the Public Religion Research Institute that was published in the Atlantic. And they looked at where are the places where we're likely to encounter religious diversity as adults. And you can see that in the workplace is actually the place where people are most likely, at about 70%, to interact with people who do not share their religion. Look at the smallest percentage, which is less than 10% at religious services. And yes, that makes sense that we're having religious services with people that we have the same beliefs or we share similar beliefs. But how much interaction do we do with other groups, with other communities? Notice that even in friendship circles, it's less than 50%. In a school my child is attending, less than 20%. So there are lots of opportunities for us to interact with people who do not share our religion. And one of the things that we want to look at is how can we alter these numbers? How can we create programming and opportunities where we are not just coming together and seeing each other, but learning from one another? And I would say authentically finding out what is of issue and concern to the people who may share our block, may not share our beliefs, but we share the same neighborhood, or in this instance, the same district. I wanted to also talk a little bit about conflict and the elements of conflict. So when we talk about religious and racial strife, religious and racial discrimination, the incredible rise of hate crimes against Jews and an incredible increase of anti-Semitism, one of the things that I don't think that we spend enough time looking at is the elements of conflict. So one of the questions that we received in advance asked, why is it that the blatant hatred and violence against Jewish people are not publicly called out by Asians, Blacks, and Hispanics? And I think that there's something to this, but I also would say that I was someone who went to the March Against Anti-Semitism in January of 2020, before the COVID crisis had descended upon the land. And I remember being at that march. I remember being one of the only African-American people that I could see in my immediate area, and that didn't mean I was the only one there. But I also noticed the reaction that people were having to me being there. Now, we want to remember that the march took place after a number of incidents in the area, and one of them that took place in New Jersey was perpetrated by African-American people, or allegedly perpetrated by African-American people. So I could actually understand why my presence may have raised some concern. Because if I'm just me, just this one person with no sign and no affiliation, what is my intent? And I think that we want to at least consider that some of the reasons why we may not see all of us coming out to support all of us at the same time or around the same issues is because we may not have actually built enough relationship with communities to be standing publicly with one another. When we look at the elements of conflict, you'll see that at the very bottom of this conflict volcano are interests. And right above that are the positions. The feelings are often expressed as the lava that comes flowing out of the volcano. And the sunlight kind of shines down on the whole scene as the worldview, the perspective that we hold for all of this. And I'd like for you to consider that when we're talking about the positions that people take, we're often hearing about what someone wants or they demand in a conflict situation. And we hear a lot of that. We hear a lot of demands. And I would say over the last 10 years in particular, we've been hearing choruses of demands from people who have been disassociated, people who have experienced inequity and prejudice and discrimination and hatred and violence, starting with the Me Too movement, and then the Black Lives Matters movement, and then the ongoing movement around LGBTQ justice, and then we had the death of George Floyd. And I would say that one of the things that is driving, or at least providing some foundation or context for people recognizing that anti-Semitism is rampant and growing, is because there has been a chorus over these more recent years of people actually asking for and demanding. We want to be treated fairly, we want to be safe, we want to be treated equitably. What we don't hear enough about in some instances are what are the needs that are foundational to those positions? What are the underlying reasons that people want whatever it is that they say that they want in a conflict situation? And I would offer that some of the conversations that we want to begin to have at the community level are not just about the positions that we're trying to take, but what are the fundamental needs that are supporting or underneath all of the positions that we're taking. And when I talk about needs, I want to be very specific that there are all kinds of needs that can be expressed. There are needs that are aesthetic, there is needs for knowledge, for self-actualization, for esteem, love and belonging, safety and security, and physiological needs. Anyone, when we're talking about racial disparities, when we're talking about anti-Semitism, when we're talking about religious discrimination against other groups, there is a need that is yet to be fulfilled. And I think that we want to spend a little bit more time on the needs that are driving the positions that people are taking. One of the things that we started to see at Tanenbaum, particularly in our workplace work, is that we see within the corporations that we're working with, more Jewish employees coming forward and asking their employers, what are you saying around anti-Semitism? What is your public stance going to be around anti-Semitism? One of some of the reasons that people say this, and we saw this in some of the questions that were presented to us before the session began, was you're addressing these issues for other groups, other issues of hate. Why are you not addressing ours? One of the things that we cannot afford is to be a conflict accountant, to actually be trying to verify or give numbers to who's standing for who when. One of the things that we actually may want to pay more attention to is what are the conditions that are allowing for hate to continue to run rampant, not just in New York City, but around the globe. Because there are some foundational issues that we have not yet addressed around the ways in which we all look at each other with, and here's one of the things just for our work at Tanenbaum, we try not to traffic in the world of tolerance. I would venture to say tolerance is what's got us to the position that we're in right now. If you're trying to build respect for religious difference, then we're going to have to do different work. We're going to have to address some of the root causes of what allows for a global pandemic to all of a sudden be blamed on Jews and Asian people, and that there is fertile soil for this kind of xenophobia. And I think that we want to begin to ask ourselves perhaps some different questions. So rather than asking the question or trying to figure out whether people think anti-Semitism is being ignored, I think we want to ask the question, why is it that so many people either don't know, don't understand, or question the existence of anti-Semitism? And we want to ask people who actually don't have answers to those questions. It's critical that if we're going to survive this, if we're truly going to build respect for religious difference, then we're going to have to go into some of the places that are a little uncomfortable and address some of both the internal biases and prejudices that we have within our respective identity groups, and then look to see what are the common places, what are the similar places where we all have a fundamental need that is not being addressed. And I fear that if we don't do that work, then we will find ourselves spinning our wheels, asking the same questions, not getting the same answers, or getting the same answers or the same results, which someone told me a long time ago was the definition of insanity. Finally, I just wanted to share with you some of our competencies for respectful communication that we share in our trainings in the different communities in which we work. As easy as it sounds, or as simple as it sounds, avoiding assumptions is one of the most important things that we can do. And avoiding the spokesperson syndrome and always speaking in the first person. I cannot sit here and speak to you on behalf of all African-American people. Not one of us can speak on behalf of everyone from an identity group that we belong to, but what we can effectively do is share what our experiences are and what are the needs that we have. I've spoken about the platinum rule. I think it's important that we also develop honest and authentic curiosity for one another and to begin to practice asking respectful questions. And the distinction is, if you're asking a question to confirm something that you think you already know, perhaps that might not be the most respectful thing that you could do. When we talk about listening actively, my mother is still very fond of reminding me that I have one mouth and two ears for a good reason, and that I want to listen more carefully and reserve judgment and reserve the almost automatic response that we have to form a response to what someone is saying before they even finish. Identifying and debunking stereotypes, addressing behavior and not belief. These are the, if you will, the kind of bread and butter of the kind of interactions that we want to engage in, that we are all free to believe as we do, but behaviorally as a society, there are expectations of us operating far more collaboratively than we have. Encourage learning and apologize and acknowledge when mistakes are made. Because here's the thing, in this work, we are going to make mistakes. We are going to say the wrong thing. We are going to step on each other's toes once in a while. And then we want to be able to acknowledge and apologize for those mistakes, but also to receive the apology and maybe let the person off the hook and assume goodwill that they did not mean to intentionally disrupt you. At this point, I will stop my presentation and I will turn this over to my next colleague.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was great. And yes, the next colleague is Deputy Commissioner Brittny Saunders from the New York City Human Rights Commission. Hi, Brittny.
Hi, thank you so much. Hold on one moment. I'm just going to begin sharing my screen. And then we'll start with the show. So thank you so much, everyone. My name is Brittny Saunders. I am Deputy Commissioner for Strategic Initiatives at the New York City Commission on Human Rights. Very briefly, the Commission is the New York City agency that is responsible for educating New Yorkers about and also enforcing the New York City human rights law. And I'm going to share just a little bit about the origins of the Commission. I won't go into it too deeply, but it's worth noting that the Commission has its roots in a lot of advocacy and organizing by regular New Yorkers. So what we're looking at here is a telegraph from the NAACP actually to Mayor LaGuardia, advocating for him to start a commission in the wake of some uprisings in Harlem around, unequal treatment of Black New Yorkers. And then this, of course, is just a little bit about the original intention of the commission. I'm going to move through these, a little bit about how it changed into an official city agency, and then land at the city human rights law itself. So yes, as noted, the commission has a long history of working to, fight for the dignity and the respect of all New Yorkers. It has evolved quite a bit over time. It has often been a reflection of the leadership of the city as well, like any other city agency. The law that we enforce, the New York City Human Rights Law, is also kind of a reflection of the changing values and the evolving values in the city of New York. So as a high level point, it covers discrimination in the workplace. It covers discrimination in places of public accommodation. So also places and spaces that are open to the public. Those might be stores, restaurants, theaters, et cetera. It covers discrimination in housing. And then there are also a couple other areas, discriminatory harassment, which is meant to cover situations where there's discrimination or harassment, intimidation, perpetrated by one New Yorker against another, but where there isn't that, employer-employee relationship or, housing provider, tenant relationship. And in addition, we have another area of jurisdiction called bias-based profiling. This area was significantly strengthened in 2013 after advocacy by police reform groups here in New York City. And it really applies to those situations where one is targeted for law enforcement activity, not on the basis of, a suspicion that they engaged in illegal activity, but rather on the basis of, one of several protected categories, including race, religion, age, many others as well. And the point that I'll make here, not dwelling too long, is that our law is also very broad and encompassing when it comes to the categories of protection for which people receive protection, right? So we have protection on the basis of race and religion and age and disability and gender and other categories that you'll see in local and state and federal human rights laws across the country. But we also have some categories of protection that are a little bit unique and that reflect the commitment of the people of New York to pushing over time for more and more protection. So one of these is, for example, protection on the basis of arrest or conviction history in the employment space. Another is in the housing space, for example, there's protection for the presence of children, and many, many others, which I encourage you to learn about by visiting the Commission website. And I know that a number of resources about the Commission are going to be dropped into the chat. And I'll share again very quickly a little bit about the structure of the agency. So to give you a sense of how is it that we go about on a day-to-day basis trying to fulfill this dual mission of educating New Yorkers about their rights and then also enforcing those rights and enforcing those obligations. We have a community relations bureau that's staffed by folks who have deep relationships with communities across the city. Those folks do trainings, they do workshops, they lead programming, they do other programming in order to educate New Yorkers about their rights and about their obligations under the city human rights law. We also have a staff of attorneys. Those are the folks who take in and investigate reports of discrimination, and they, will litigate those claims. They will resolve those complaints sometimes through settlements and other things. We have an Office of Mediation and Conflict Resolution that does really tremendous work where folks are interested in seeking a kind of jointly arrived at resolution. And then we also have the Office of the Chair, which is where I sit, and that's an office that works with other partners in city government, state government, et cetera. It is the office that will put together policy, review legislation, and take a number of other steps to clarify protections that New Yorkers enjoy, and to do research and take other steps to kind of highlight discrimination that New Yorkers are experiencing. Just a really quick point before continuing with the rest of the presentation. I just wanted to we talked, or rather I talked at the beginning about the history of the Commission and how it really originated with New Yorkers who made this demand, right, that their rights be respected and that the city government become more active in protecting those rights and in fostering the sort of culture in the city that would keep them safe. And this is just a point to make it clear that obviously that struggle continues. That is part of why we are gathered here today. Senator Krueger shared some really sobering numbers around the rise in hate crimes across different communities over the last year. And in addition to that, from where we sit at the commission, we really have an opportunity to hear from a range of communities about the discrimination and the harassment that they are experiencing. And we find that there are, certainly the threats that different communities face, they're not identical, but there are overlaps, there are connections between the threats that different communities encounter and the things that people experience at the intersections. So one of the strategies that we use in order to address and hopefully also to prevent, bias incidents and hate incidents is research and reporting. So one of the most important things that we can do as the commission is to understand more deeply what communities are experiencing, and then lift up that information, share it with our collaborators in city government, other folks in city government, share it with folks in civic spaces, faith spaces, and really help to support the advocacy of communities for new programming or new policy, whatever it might be. So, one of the projects I want to just share a little bit about, I won't go over all the bullets on this slide, is a research project we released in June of 2018. And this was focused on xenophobia, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism in New York, and was based on a survey that we conducted with thousands of Muslim, Arab, South Asian, Jewish, and Sikh New Yorkers who shared with us, reasons why they would not necessarily report the experiences that they were having, with discrimination in work, experiences that they were having in the subway and public transportation as well. And, some of those statistics are here, and I certainly encourage folks to, visit the Commission's website and maybe review this research and some of the fact sheets so you can see a little bit more about what we learned from that endeavor. But, the next question, of course, is, well, what does the commission do with information like that? And so, one thing I wanted to share, or a couple examples I wanted to share about how we use that information to inform our practice and hopefully inform that of other agencies and actors, is that, we launched an ad campaign on social media and in 15 ethnic media outlets. We published a fact sheet in 12 languages based on key statistics from the report. We identified a series of action steps, for example, creating a pilot referral network with community-based and faith-based organizations in the communities that we had done the research with, so that those who had trusted relationships in these communities could be trained to identify when there might be a human rights law violation, and then to kind of help bring those to our attention and kind of hand folks off to the commission so that folks could take advantage of our resources. We also, this is one of our first forays into bystander intervention training. The first wave that we did in response to this work was to targeted city employees, and took a number of other steps as well based on what we learned from this research. Similarly, in 2018, we began a research project focused on Black New Yorkers and their experiences with discrimination and harassment. And, folks described for us a set of experiences that were inescapable and emotionally taxing. They talked about experiences in healthcare settings, in the workplace, in housing, in their neighborhoods, on the street, often with law enforcement as well. And we developed a set of recommendations as well for steps that we could take as the commission in order to address these concerns, and have been working on those ever since. And then I just want to quickly cycle through some of the campaigns that we have done, because in addition to research and reporting, we view one of our important roles as trying to champion the culture and the values that that New York City should really be epitomizing, right? So making sure that we make the wonderful diversity of this city visible, and also send the message that communities that have often been marginalized and oppressed are entitled to respect, are entitled to dignity, are members of this community, belong, should be able to shape the future of this community as well. So this is from a campaign that we initiated in 2016 and 17 called I Am Muslim, I Am NYC, and was originated at a time when there was so much anti-Muslim rhetoric coming out of the presidential election at the time, but also in other spaces. We did a campaign called You Have the Right NYC, again, focusing on racial and religious discrimination broadly, encouraging folks to report to the commission, sharing stories and videos from New Yorkers who had experienced discrimination and who received support from the commission. We did a campaign in spring of 2019 that was focused on the experiences, again, of Black New Yorkers, focused on the fact that shopping while Black, walking while Black, renting while Black, and working while Black are all human rights, that folks should not be targeted for harassment or intimidation while they're engaged in day-to-day activities. We did a campaign making it clear that Jewish New Yorkers belong here, belong in this community, also showcasing diversity within Jewish communities. And this was, again, around the time of the COVID-19 pandemic when it emerged. And as Mark made the point, you heard there was fertile ground for these beliefs around the origins of the epidemic. And so we wanted to make sure we combated that. This was part of a similar effort here, specifically related to COVID-19 and specifically pointing out that discrimination, due to COVID-19 is illegal. And then finally, a campaign that we ran over the last year called I Still Believe in Our City, which really was meant to highlight, the fact that Asian American, Pacific Islander New Yorkers are a part of this community. They belong, should not be subjected to harassment and discrimination, and also importantly highlight the importance of solidarity. Here, shown in this image of an AAPI New Yorker and a Black New Yorker, and showing how important it is for us to stand and hold each other's backs in this fight against hate. Very, very quickly, I'll just say that one of the other strategies that we utilize is bias intervention. So when these incidents happen, we're very fortunate to have some really wonderful community liaisons who have close connections to specific groups and populations in New York. And they, along with other commission staff, are able to respond through canvassing, through bystander intervention training, through virtual forums and town halls. I can share a little bit more about bystander intervention as a strategy, maybe later in the conversation, but that's one of the things that we have found to be incredibly helpful. And we've had some wonderful partners like the Center for Anti-Violence Education that have helped us develop that programming. And then finally, just a quick word on restorative justice. To the Reverend's point, there's a lot of community building and relationship building over time that needs to be done to allow us to show up for one another consistently. And I think we feel strongly at the Commission that restorative justice practices, community building circles, those sorts of things can be incredibly helpful in this space. And so I will maybe stop there because I know that we have a lot of other wonderful content that we're going to move to, but I'm also happy to chime in the Q&A. So I'm going to stop sharing now and hand it over.
Thank you so much, Brittany. I didn't mean to try to cut you off because there is so much great material. And I think certainly from discussions I've had, the bystander training is perhaps something else we need to make sure people know about, because I know young people in particular feel very frightened and confused about what they should do if they're seeing this and they don't know how to handle it. It's sort of like the issues of bullying, where we assume as adults, that young people understand the signals and what's going on, but they don't, and they don't know how to deal with it. So, of all the things you're talking about, I immediately was like, oh, another town hall, or another bystander training town hall would be great. Wendy, my wonderful staff who's listening. With that, I would like to turn it over to Reverend Dr. Chloe Breyer.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, Senator Krueger, and thank you for bringing together a great panel. And I have to just say before launching off that my son brought that bystander training to his school and can vouch for how powerful it was in so many different contexts. So I can't commend that training more as a very concrete way of how to be an empowered New Yorker, so you don't sort of feel a complete loss when something happens right in front of you. So thank you for that. Again, my name is the Reverend Chloe Breyer. I'm directing the Interfaith Center of New York, which is an organization that's been around really now for almost a quarter century here in New York City, with the focus of really bringing together grassroots and immigrant religious leaders to address shared concerns and combat hatred. And it's a very practical sort of interfaith work that we do. Before being more explicit about that, I just like to remind people of the miracle in which of New York City, because sometimes I think we forget that we live in a metropolis of 8.6 million people with a school system where there are 180 languages. There have been reports about how New York City is actually the place where linguists go to find languages that don't exist anywhere on earth. We have within our borders in Flushing, for example, the most diverse place in the planet that National Geographic has shown. If you take DNA from somebody in that particular part, you will see that there are more different people who live there with different languages and different backgrounds. Indeed, over 35% of us comes from another country and another culture. And often we are coming here because of difficult and extremely traumatic experiences that we have been able to survive. So we do all that and we somehow, more often than not, we're not constantly at war with one another, which is in itself a quite extraordinary fact. Now, having said that, what do we as a nonprofit organization that has dedicated ourselves to interfaith really from the street level, what is it that we have learned about how we can combat hatred and the growth of suspicion and prejudice among us? Well, we've had lots of opportunity to do that, unfortunately. And I would say that there are three categories of activity that come to mind. First, of course, is the importance of rapid response. When going back to 9/11, we had the opportunity to bring together the first interfaith press conference that happened on that, I believe it was a Friday of that week, where we had imams standing together with rabbis and pastors and people from Afro-Caribbean traditions condemning what had happened at the Twin Towers. Now, why do I bring that up? Because it's been, as we all have kind of accepted as commonplace, it is not enough to have people of your own ethnicity and faith tradition grabbing the microphone and saying this is wrong when something, a hate crime happens in our community or a terrorist attack happens in our community. We must stand side by side with people who were not the victims of these outcry, of these attacks. And it is in that the power, that picture that we just saw of the Asian American woman and her, her African American counterpart together, standing up together is what is the power of rapid response when something awful happens. The other thing is that we've realized is that it's a failure. Really, when we have to rapidly respond in that way, we've not done our job, because we haven't produced the resiliency in our community that is the painstaking and often very boring work, but absolutely essential to do together. And so the second area of activity that the Interfaith Center has deeply engaged with, more along the lines of what Tanenbaum has done, is education. And there's just no substitute. There is no substitute for education. And I think that we do this in a couple ways. We think that it is vitally important for these grassroots religious leaders, whether they have, been in their community as a leader, very recently, because their community is a New Yorker community, or whether they've been here, for 400 years, and they're, still important leaders in their communities. What's so important is that civics education, which has really been lost in many of the schools, that is a vital way to become knowledgeable, not only about your neighbor, but the city structures in which you live, and which, if you know them, give you power. And not only that, give you and your community power. Now, my colleague, Dr. Henry Goldschmidt, always begins his talks with handing out the list of alternate side parking exemptions, which, if you're not a New Yorker, you have no idea what I'm talking about. But these are often ways of measuring. If you recall, they're probably not so long ago, there would probably be Christmas and Easter, July 4th, and Veterans Day. Now, over time, however, communities begin to engage in the life of the city, and you have not one, but two Jewish holidays that are exempt from those parking regulations. And eventually then we have not one, but two Eids, and we have Diwali, and I think Lunar New Year is, so it's a way actually of measuring the degree to which a faith community has been able to engage in the mechanism of our shared civic life and actually sort of produce something for its community. But it's not only about learning how to provide for your own community. We have a program called the Interfaith Civic Leadership Academy, which is designed to have young emerging faith leaders from diverse traditions come together and do trainings on how city government works and how community organizing works. And we have people, presentations from the Advocacy Institute to know how can you influence the city budget or the state budget, or IAF, the Industrial Areas Foundation, has such just extraordinary gifts for how to live in a democracy. And we think that those diverse communities of faith are among the most important to know those tools and can't be left out in a ghettoized situation. And then at the very end of that, cohort of leaders will provide a small pot of funding in which somebody can do an event for their community and for the wider community. And what's so poignant about that is that you see it's something that's both good for the religious community, but also good for the civic values of the city. And there are too many faith leaders who say those things are incompatible. That if you sort of water down your faith by, showing up for jury duty or encouraging people to vote, somehow that's like making you less of a religious leader. Well, I think what some of these projects in our experience has shown is quite the opposite. We had two emerging, very wonderful young Guyanese Hindu leaders, one from the Bronx, one from Queens. And what they figured out they wanted to do with their funding was to do a beach cleanup. Okay, get this, a beach cleanup of Jamaica Bay, because what they discovered is that there were many people in their communities who kind of had imported a habit or tradition of sort of discarding in what they thought was a respectful way, the images, the statues, the offerings that they had made at the temple into the bay. Because these were sacred objects, and they felt like this was a way. And what these two young faith leaders were decided was that they were going to challenge this kind of old and not particularly right now, right on concept of how to dispose of sacred objects, given where we are on the planet. They're going to challenge that, and they're also going to engage their own community in providing a service to the wider community, which was just so beautiful, because you can see how you can both kind of provide life and engagement by just helping faith leaders learn more about how they can influence their own communities and the wider community. So that was one form of education, this civics education. And then the second, the other form of education that we think is really important is religious diversity education for non-religious leaders, like teachers or social workers, people who are professionals whose job it is to interact with many religious leaders and communities that they don't necessarily know that much about. And because we're New York City, it's actually helpful to know a bit more about them. And if you're a social worker, trying to understand like what are the habits of corporal punishment, for example, among kind of some more West African communities, or like what might be understandings that parents do or don't have that were different. And it's stuff that we've been doing for, 250 years. But in New York City, I think it provides religious diversity education really helps in a way that it might not so much elsewhere. And this goes in particular as it circles back as we look at hate crimes and hate crimes that are based on religious difference. We have to look at the role of the police. And I came to our attention, I think back in 2011, when there was, excuse me, I'm going to say the bad old days, because there was the anti-radicalization report that came out from the NYPD, and it equated the prayer practices, the basic fundamental practices of Islam with terrorism. And that was just wrong. And so what was happening is that you had people coming in, for example, the Third Jihad, which was a very anti-Muslim film that was being shown to 1,500 cadets, in their break, and teaching them all these kinds of things about Islam that just weren't true. So how is it then that when people, do tend to look to the police, often still, with some exceptions, but, that what they do and how they treated, Muslim New Yorkers was picked up by other people. And so if they didn't have the knowledge of how to basically respect religious rights of 10% of the school system in New York, and that's how many Muslim New Yorker families are in the public schools. Well, how could we, the rest of us, really learn? So with that, we worked for many years and produced something called policing. Policing the multicultural New York, which is actually still I really commend that to you, because it now has as a forward, it started under Commissioner O'Neill, but it now has a kind of introduction from Commissioner Shea. And it's directed towards new cadets. It's supposed to be shown, we're now updating it to be something that the police can do on using handheld devices. This is very much a sort of older school, like you'd screen it at the police academy. But it's looking at like only four important faith traditions that you as a police officer might meet on the street and have some like misunderstandings about. And we look at Islam, we look at the varieties of traditions in New York, of which there are massive numbers. We look at Hasidic Jewish communities and how important it is for them, on the Sabbath, how they might be walking, they might not have identification on them. And it's more of a religious reason. I mean, just basic things. And then also, Afro-Caribbean traditions, where the beads or the colors that they're wearing might be confused as to be gang symbols, or things that are as basic as that. But also just, it's a beautiful film because the images, and that's what we so often miss in the press, because when we look at the media, often what we're shown is very kind of scary looking people, whether they're scary or not, but that's what tends to be picked up in the news. So I commend this to you. It's a 15-20 minute video that's just supposed to be an introduction to some of the faiths of New York City. We talk about the Sikh tradition as well, the 5 Ks, sort of, you'll see. Anyway, that I think really says about how helpful religious diversity can be as a window. And then finally, I want to close with a third strategy that we have for strengthening the civic fabric of our city as a kind of preemptive way of trying to combat hate. And that is this idea for a sort of preference for doing interfaith work in the public square. And sometimes that means in institutions like the New York Public Library, or the courts, like jury duty, who knew? But if you could just move jury duty, back like 3 hours on Friday, you could get this whole other group of people who, have a Sabbath then to be able to be included and to be part of our system. Anyway, I think I'm going to end. The census was also a big one, but it sounds to me like my time is out anyway. And I want to just thank you and leave it there and say that we look forward to questions.
Well, thank you very much, Chloe. Thank you, all three of you. Yes, we're a little behind time, but that's okay.
Sorry.
I'm going to just start with questions. And I already know a few of the people who are supposed to maybe take some of them. So I'll just start with Mark. Was there a time in New York's history when intolerance was less prevalent? And why was that? What are the lessons maybe we can learn from times that we were getting along better, if we ever were?
So I think the answer to this question is no. There was not a time where things were better and where we were getting along better. One of the documents that was shared in the chat that we created actually in partnership in a project that we worked on with Interfaith Center and Intersections International and a couple of other organizations was a fact sheet on opposition to houses of worship in New York City over time. And what you see is that from the beginning of the creation of the city, there has been opposition to various groups at different times. I think what has happened is that we live in the 21st century. We get information millisecond by millisecond. I think it is harder to hide the bias that we actually have toward one another that we're unwilling to admit. And because we're unwilling to admit those things, then we never quite get to the core of what will make the difference in standing for someone as an ally or as a bystander. So I would say that I would also say that there's this opportunity that we have to not kind of blame one another, but to turn our attention to the person, ideal, entity that's driving the whole thing. And to the point about like the numbers of people who have experienced bias and discrimination, if we like kind of roll the tape back to the founding of the city, you'll see that there was probably very little legal protection for religious minorities, anybody other than Christians, and anyone in particular other than Protestants in the beginning. And that evolution is what we are also seeing. So I think that we're in a unique place to build the foundation for how to stand for one another and get along. But I do not believe that there was a time where everything was better and we're trying to get back to that time.
I agree with you. And, you know, we didn't advertise this as throwing in, you know, concerns for immigrants in the context of what we're talking about, but it's very much an overlapping set of discussions. And many people are having discussions about, you know, new Americans and new New Yorkers. And even one of the people asked the question, why are we inviting people into our country who are haters? And I'd like to answer that I don't think we are. And I think a tiny percentage of new Americans are actually haters. And the vast majority of new Americans came here for the exact same reasons that our parents and grandparents came here. Okay, perhaps with Mark and Brittany, your ancestors might have been dragged here in chains as opposed to choosing to come here, an important difference. But I know my grandparents were escaping the pogroms of Eastern Europe, and other people's family were escaping other terrible things going on. And the entire story of this country are immigrants coming here because they want better for themselves and their children. And we forget how quickly that we all weren't popular when we first got here. I mean, Jews really weren't popular when we got here, but you know what? Irish people also really weren't popular when they got here. They said the worst things of, oh my God, they were all, you know, they were all suffering horrible diseases that they were going to spread and kill us all. They believed in this very strange religion. I think it was Catholicism, which I don't think we think of as a particularly strange religion anymore. And, you know, and horrible things. And then Italians, we didn't like Italians when they got here either. And so you have to really ask yourself, I think, important, hard questions about who is attacking whom and on what basis? And does that then turn into sometimes racial and religious hatred when it's perhaps fear of others and fear of new? And again, as one of you pointed out, the number of languages, in New York City is unimaginable anywhere else in the world, because it is all these people fighting to get here against incredible odds just so they can do better for themselves and for their families. And that's, yes, you could always find a problem person from any community, but really that is why 99.5% of anybody who's coming to America is coming here, to do better and to merge into our society. So I just wanted to address that. So Chloe, do you agree that anti-Semitism is taken less seriously than other forms of bigotry? And the example, I guess, of the questions are, where are the parades? Where are the protests? And where is the media coverage other than quick mention on the local news?
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that. I think that there is a long tradition. I mean, actually, the ADL has one of the great, they have really helped other traditions in the area of identifying hate symbols. For example, I can't think of anyone domestically who has a more extensive understanding of like, what are the symbols of Christian nationalism, of not the Nazi, like, it's just, and that actually is a resource for other faith traditions. So in some ways, I look at anti-Semitism as and the struggle to identify anti-Semitism as one of the really leading the banner, of which, other groups that have been also discriminated against, are actually looking at how it's been sort of done to educate people about it, to, and so, this weekend, I think there's a demonstration in front of the US Capitol that's happening with the son of Elie Wiesel is helping to organize. And as we mentioned, so I don't agree with the premise, I think, of that question.
Fair enough. So, but as a follow-up to whoever, do we think that there are added responses we can give through our colleges and now even unions that are becoming politicized in ways that sometimes they're isolating others? So I'd say one of the highlight examples I know that is a growing issue on college campuses is the both anti-Semitism / anti-Israel, anti-Muslim / Palestinian rights conflicts that, look, we live in a world where we know these are going on, and they do tend to have flash up experiences. And I'm curious because as a Jew myself, who's a Zionist, but makes very clear that doesn't mean I have to agree with the government of Israel on every issue every day, because guess what? I'm a member of the American government and I do not agree with the US government on everything every day. But these things all seem to be blending, even though I actually think that they're separate discussions that it's very hard to keep separate, and is, impacting, I think, particularly our college student population and our young people in ways where they also are not even sure how to get their arms around it. So I'm wondering whether any of your organizations have dealt specifically with those kinds of issues.
Can I just to follow that up, because yeah. I'm getting a slightly different angle on the first question based on this follow-up, because if what the concern is that there are geopolitical conflicts that are having ramifications here in the United States and in New York City, the answer is yes. Yes, they are. And there's a reason that the conflict in the Middle East has been the thing that has been in some ways most disruptive of ongoing Jewish, Christian, Muslim relations here in New York City. And that is still true. And we saw that very recently with vandalizing. We went out to someone had like written "Death to Palestine" on the door of a Pakistani mosque on Ocean Parkway. I don't know what to, I mean, I don't know. I just think it's a reminder that in case anyone thought interfaith conflict resolution was easy, right? It's a reminder that it's not, because there are circumstances that no matter where we live or who we see that can trigger us. And that's what's happened to me, I think, recently.
The only thing that I would add to that, in talking about specifically, one of the things I think that we may want to begin to practice more is to speak about the specifics of dynamics in particular groups and not look for similarities among them all the time. Talking about political impact of labor unions and their responses to either racial prejudice or anti-Semitism, and collapsing that with the challenges of expression and safety on college campuses, I think is putting too many things in a stew that don't belong together. When I think about, I mean, there have been reports probably for the last 10 or 15 years and longer than that, but public reports about Jewish students being challenged solely on their identity as Jews, as to whether they can serve on the student. There was one article I remember in particular where there was a young woman who was voted into office as the student body president at a university, and then there was a challenge to her candidacy as to whether she could fairly represent all students, including those who were standing for Palestine. And so as long as that's a question, then we want to kind of rewind the tape to and ask a different question, as I was saying before, which is not just why are you asking this about this young woman? Why does that exist in our society? Where does that come from? That someone who is Jewish would somehow not be able to fairly administrate among their colleagues. Well, we could actually look back to the founding of the country and look at the laws that we put on the books of who could even run for office. So I think that we have to, some of the work that we do and some of the work I know that Chloe does as well, is really trying to unpack and give people access to what's the authentic story that you're operating from. Because there's a little bit of a fantasy life that we have in New York City, because I agree with all of the statistics that we have about the diversity that's present in the city, but that diversity often happens in a vacuum. People's neighborhoods are no longer than a block or two. And the interactions that we have with one another generally tend to be in silence, in silo, on public transportation, passing each other and not interacting with one another, and only in crisis. And even when crisis has happened, like a global pandemic, then that didn't even stop the inherent anti-Semitism and racism. All it did was exacerbate it and make it more visible to be seen. So I think that, we want to, to kind of use scripture, which I very rarely do, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And really get into the weeds with these topics, because looking at them on a surface level, I don't think is going to actually yield the results that we want.
I have to say, when the shooting incident in the Pittsburgh synagogue happened a couple of years ago, immediately my colleagues of color actually reached out to me to say how terrible they felt about this. And I knew that my synagogue would be doing something in its next services on the Sabbath. And I invited my colleagues, anybody who wanted to come with me to my synagogue for a Friday night service. And I think 6 came, and it was a beautiful service. And people who watch this know I go to Central Synagogue because I had Angela Buchwald on another of these events so that they know she's my rabbi. And she did a beautiful service. And afterwards we went, of course, for Chinese food, because what do you do after a Jewish event? You go for Chinese food. And they were all saying that they had never been in a synagogue. I was like, really? I've been in lots of Black and Latino churches. I go, how come? And they said, no one ever invited us before. And I felt like, oh my God, like they're, and they go like, we don't necessarily represent Jewish communities, although of course we have Jewish constituents, and there's not a lot of synagogues in our neighborhoods. And no one ever invited us to come to a service. And everybody really had a great time. And the synagogue, the rabbi made a little bit of a big deal about them all showing up. And it was just fascinating to me, because it's exactly what you just said, Mark. We make assumptions that just actually aren't true about how we live together in peace and harmony. And there's so many people from so many places, it's impossible not to know a little bit of everybody. Because, we know that we do have segregated neighborhoods and segregated schools, and apparently we forget to invite each other to each other's religious institutions every once in a while also. So I really appreciate that. And it is so much, again, I think about fostering respect for others, even if you can't or you don't understand, or you may not agree, because as Chloe was saying, when it gets to, the separation between, nationalistic and political fights in our own country or between countries, and wars and histories of violence, and then trying to bring that together for people to live together reasonably and with respect in our city, in our country. It is about how we teach each other to respect and are willing to be accepting of each other. So I guess, Brittany, a lot of the projects you talked about the commission doing, and the reports and the materials, do you actually see that you see an increase in mutual understanding and respect from people who participate in your programs?
I think it's not always kind of clear cut and easy to measure. I think we really try to create like spaces for, and increasingly are trying to create spaces for like sustained engagement, precisely so we can have a sense of whether or not that's actually happening. But I think about, for example, in the last couple of years, we've really focused on trying to build out our programming with young people. And so, for example, we've created a Youth for Empowerment and Solidarity Council to really have some young people who help us shape our youth programming and roll it out. And I think in that space where you have people, convening repeatedly, these young people are getting to know each other and build relationships with one another over the course of the year. I think that's definitely a space where we feel like we've seen increased, I guess, mutual respect over time. And I think that's really something that we aspire to be able to do more of. So I talked a little bit about restorative justice, and I was really struck when Reverend Fowler said what he said about how people ask, why don't you see people showing up for one another with regularity? But the truth is that becomes easier and more likely when you have people interacting and building relationship regularly, right? And you have people building those relationships over time and building community over time, so that when crises happen, that is more of a thing that people feel compelled to do. And so one of the things that we've been trying to think creatively about, it's been hard in these current budget climates, but is like, how can we get or, support other people getting resources to do some of that, apply some of those restorative justice practices more widely with people over time, both actually meeting the needs of folks within specific communities, because often there's a need for healing and addressing particular traumas in particular communities, but also doing that and creating spaces where folks can come together and connect over time. And so we can see some of that change over time. So it's certainly not clear cut. I like to believe that, the campaigns that we do, resonate with people. I think we certainly saw a lot of that with the I Still Believe in Our City campaign over the last year, people feeling seen, feeling heard, and compelled by that work. I think it's also been true with some of our other work as well, particularly with other artists. But it's a work in progress.
This is a tough one, and we got lots of tough questions tonight. So because of all the tensions between different communities in the NYPD and different styles of policing in different communities, do we think that the overall issues within the context of NYPD, changes in views about how to handle crimes in general, restorative justice, that they've actually somehow triggered hate crimes?
I have to say for myself, I'm not sure that that's actually the case. I think that it is probably high time that we thought more creatively about what it really takes to guarantee, our safety and to build a community in which people can be safe and feel safe. And I think we know, one of the key learnings from the work that we did with Black New Yorkers was how very unsafe, many people feel and have felt for a very, very long time, going back to Reverend Fowler's point, the kind of founding and establishment of the city, how very unsafe people have felt in relationship to law enforcement. So I just have to believe that we are creative enough and we can eventually build enough political will to find ways that guarantee all of our safety without, requiring anyone to experience humiliation, disrespect, violence, any of those things. But that's me.
Anyone else have a different perspective? Okay, we will move on to the next question. And we maybe only have time for one more question. Let's see. So many. So I guess just for each of you, if you were to take your own experience and what you do and tell us one thing that we could change in our daily lives that probably would contribute something to our communities to decrease the lack of understanding between ourselves based on religion and race and increase positive experiences, what would you recommend?
I'd like, no, go ahead, Brittny.
Very quickly, I would just say, in the very practical sense, sign up for a bystander intervention training at the commission. But I think something that folks can also consider doing, and this isn't, groundbreaking, lots of folks have said this, but I think calling in friends, relatives, folks that we hear, making intolerant remarks or engaging in, I think there's a lot that we can do to leverage our connections to other people who might be friends or who might be family rather, and to, find a way to try to redirect their behavior, to try to, over time, kind of introduce different beliefs or different ways of looking at things. I know it's not simple, but I do feel like that's a major responsibility that a lot of us have.
Mm-hmm. Mark, you were gonna go.
Yeah, I was just going to say that there were a couple of links that were shared in the chat, and I know they'll be shared afterwards. We did 2 conversations last year on the intersection of privilege, race, and religion. And one of the things that we have yet to fully address is, and I don't mean just in this forum, but just generally, is that we have not really delved very deeply into white Christian supremacy and its foundational anchor to many of the issues that we're talking about. And someone asked a question in the chat, and wondering the degree to which beneficiaries of oppression. And I think that there's a lot to that we don't yet fully have our arms around the impact of supremacy, colonialism, and how that is the foundation of everything that we're dealing with. And yet we're trying to build almost on quicksand by not addressing that. And so the one thing I think people could do, 2 books, the White Christian Privilege, The Illusion of Religious Equality by Dr. Kiati Joshi, and second book, Ending White Supremacy by Dr. Robert P. Jones, Public Religion Research Institute, and a book that I think is critical is also American Grace. And I don't remember, I can't remember the names of the authors at this time, but read one of those books because religion has a profound impact, and I'm convinced the things we've been unwilling to address and discuss in terms of our own internal and external biases toward one another will be our undoing for real this time.
Thank you. And Chloe, I'll give you the last words.
I would suggest that you get your house of worship to do a voter registration drive. And if you're feeling really adventurous, do it with another house of worship of a different faith tradition in your neighborhood.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Well, sincerely, thank all 3 of you, Reverend Dr. Breyer, Reverend Fowler, and Deputy Commissioner Saunders. You all provided us with a lot to think about, a lot of things to do, especially if you're following the chat information we've already received, and been willing to be open and confront some really hard issues in our society. And no, I didn't get to every question that everyone asked. I tried to be a little bit selective with things that I thought spread us out around the various topics. I want to let people know that we are planning new events for the fall. We don't have anything to announce yet. We allow you all to take August off and not be forced to participate in our voluntary evening discussions. I do hope everybody's going to have a great summer. Let's hope the weather gets a little better for us all. And then in the fall, we will have a whole new collection of issues to follow up on, but I definitely want to be following up on the trainings that the commission discussed. So thank you all very much. And thank you everybody out there, and stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.